I'm Matt. Thank you guys for joining me for episode 9 of the First Synth series. To be honest with you, I did not think that I would be able to get this many creators on board to work with me for this series, but it's been such a joy to have so many folks out there, so many wonderful YouTube creators who have agreed to share their First Synth stories with you and with me here on this channel. So again, my thanks to today's presenters for taking the time and putting the effort forth to share their stories. If you haven't seen the First Synth series before now, again, this is episode 9, so there's 8 other series, so a total of 32 other creators whose stories you'll want to catch. There'll be a playlist below in the description for this video where you can catch up on all those past episodes. But for now, I hope you'll enjoy episode 9 of the First Synth series. Thanks.
Howdy doody, Matt, and everyone else, I guess. My name is Cameron, better known as Venus Theory, and this is my story of how I got hooked on synthesis. Way back when I was a young, feeble lad, I absolutely hated electronic music. I could not stand the stuff, and I think that was just due to my own restrictions and upbringing. I always thought that real music was, people playing instruments and recording it on a big console in a studio and whatever, and I just could not stand a lot of electronic music. And at the time, this was when things like, Skrillex and stuff were really starting to pop off and just become overbearing and annoying, and I just couldn't stand it. It just didn't seem real enough to me. Man, I don't know. I guess just being a pretentious teenager that knew everything about everything, that was sort of the state of things. As time went on and as my musical tastes and stuff expanded, I started to get into, sort of more experimental leaning music, things like Porcupine Tree, a little bit of Dream Theater, a lot of things like Meshuggah, Animals as Leaders, and Periphery, and things like that. Had my cool 8-string guitar at the time, and a lot of these bands were incorporating synth sounds and sort of textures while still retaining, the front of the music being guitars and drums and bass and vocals and things that I considered real, proper music. I was getting pretty okay at working my way through the DAW, and I was starting to wrap my head around things like MIDI and drum programming, and of course I had the obligatory drum kit from Hell plugin for all the edgy 2010s metalheads out there, and eventually I decided to get a synth to start exploring that, and after a bunch of research and listening to demos and stuff, I landed on Native Instruments FM8, and that was an absolutely terrible choice because FM is complicated enough, let alone how open-ended FM8 ends up making it, so not a great start in hindsight. Most of my use of FM8 just amounted to preset surfing and kind of picking things apart and wondering like, if I change this sounds different, and I wish I understood why that was the case. But what this really did, was just open up the idea of using synths to me, and I started to explore more of the built-in plugins inside of Cubase that had synth engines and sample engines, and I ended up starting my years-long love affair with Retrolog inside of Cubase. Eventually though, as all roads lead, I wanted to go out and buy my first real hardware synthesizer, and it had to be real analog, because that's the way real music gets made, man. And I ended up grabbing the OG Arturia Mini Brute. This is before it was all cool and semi-modular and stuff. Honestly, it was great. It taught me a ton. It had everything you need to get started. It generated different waveforms, it had a filter, you could make noise with it, and that simple little box taught me pretty much the entire foundation of everything I know about sound design as well, because at first I thought a synth is something that, it has piano keys so you play melodies on it, but then I started to learn more about, you could use this to create a kick drum sound, or you could use the noise to replicate hi-hats and cymbals and things like that, and that really just started to, show me the wormhole of all the things I didn't understand, and I'm really grateful for that. As simple and broadly speaking, boring as the OG Mini Brute and kind of that SH-101 adjacent area is in the broader sense of all the things we can do with synths, especially now, was a great starting point. I ended up selling it a few years later, and if memory serves, my next synth was a used Korg M50, and that was quite an upgrade to say the least, but it reminded me a lot of keyboards I played when I was younger, just the junky whatever that would be at your cousin's house that had drum kits and different tones it would make and whatever, just the GM MIDI sounds. And I thought that was really neat. But the M50 had a lot of other things it could do with the synth engine and building your own sounds, but also layering them with samples and other stuff. And I thought that that was just the next logical leap, because it made a lot of sense coming from the Cubase background and the built-in synths there. And it was kind of like putting all of that in a box while still retaining all the stuff I had learned from the Arturia Mini Brute and expanding all that into something a lot more deep and usable and also polyphonic, which was a big deal to me at the time. I don't think that today it's something I would get again, just because there's a lot of other synths that do very similar things, and obviously with plugins it's more than easy enough to replicate a lot of what the Mini Brute did. But it does hold a near and dear place in my heart as like just one of those formative pieces of gear in my career, both musically and in sound design, that just, had I not took the leap on that and decided that I'm gonna try synths, I don't think I'd be anywhere near where I am today. Because the nice thing about it was it taught me a bunch, but it opened a lot more questions than it gave answers, because it just became this rabbit hole idea of how far does this go and what else can I do, and why does FM8 sound different than this thing, and why does Retrolog sound different than FM8, and what is granular, and all of this stuff. And that's a super valuable thing. And I think more than anything what that taught me was just always remain curious and never come to something with expectations. It's a lot more fun to come to it with a sense of, well, I guess we're gonna poke this around a bit and see where it goes. And yeah, that's pretty much the story of me and my first synth, and how I learned to stop worrying and love the bomb.
Hey friends, Sunwarper here. Thanks, Matt, for having me on to talk about my first synth. And I actually still have it, and it's right behind me. It's the Dave Smith Prophet 08. And this synth means a lot to me, and that's the main reason that I can't let it go, is that it's the synth I understand the most and can just quickly dial in a sound with. And there's a reason for that. I've had it since 2013, and I started playing music about 2002 when I was like 12 years old. I started with piano when I was much younger, but just never wanted to practice and hated it. But that kind of laid the foundation. And then in 2002, I started playing guitar, and it just clicked. Something just made sense with the guitar for me. And I played guitar ever since. But then in about 2009, I was trying to do the full band experience just as one person. So I needed some additional sounds. I needed to have drums, and I can't play drums, so I got into DAWs and was using Reason, and I started to go down the rabbit hole of the synths that were in there, mainly the Thor synthesizer. And as I got more and more into it, I started getting into ambient music, and then I got into Boards of Canada, and I fell in love with that warped analog sound, and I just had to get that type of sound. So I started looking into analog synths, and a lot of them were outside of my price range, but I saw the Prophet 5 as something that I couldn't get, but just loved the sound. And when I saw they had a Prophet 08 that was a lot cheaper and more in my price range, I saved up and then bought it in 2013. And I've had it ever since because I just love the sound of it. I've spent so much time learning how it all works. There's still new things I learn about it even to this day, but I know exactly what I want to use it for. I know that sound that I'm going for with it, so I can dial it in really quick. And then it's basically been on every album I've done on all these different projects, every Sunwarper album, but projects I did before Sunwarper, it's on all of those. Typically now what I like to do is send MIDI out, so if I'm playing it, I get all that MIDI in the DAW, and then I can embellish it with additional synths and do like EQ cuts and stuff. And luckily I don't have to play it 18 times because I can just use the MIDI and tweak it in there. It's a synth that I can't let go of, but I do phase it out of my workflows every once in a while, but then somehow it finds its way back because I just love the sound it makes so much. And it's not only just a synth, and it's not only just a sound, it's something that I just kind of connect with. Like the piece of hardware itself is something that I connect with, and I try to incorporate it where I can. So yeah, that's my first synth, the Prophet 08, and it's still a mainstay, if not the mainstay, of my synth workflow. I appreciate you hanging out, and many thanks again to Matt for having me on to talk about one of my favorite topics, synthesizers. If you want to check out my music, you can head to youtube.com/sunwarper or go to sunwarper.com and you'll find all the links there. But yeah, thanks for listening.
everyone, I'm Eric from Amateur Music Studio, and today I want to share my story with keyboards and synthesizers. For quite a long time when I started playing keyboards, I didn't actually own a keyboard. I was playing in different bands and in different places where there was already was a keyboard of some sort. And one of the first keyboards that I've actually managed to play extensively was kind of like a toy keyboard. It was a Yamaha PSS51, if I remember that correctly. Then a friend of mine had Yamaha PSR SQ16, which kind of like was a grown-up version of PSS51. Then I played a number of other keyboards that was like PSR 630, which came out at the time, 730, 530, Yamaha PSR series. I was lucky enough to try Roland XP80, which I remember sounded great, but interface was absolute crap. I couldn't even change the voice on it. Very first keyboard that was kind of like a professional workstation, there was a Yamaha QS300, which was brilliant. But my actually first keyboard that I owned, from what I remember, was Korg IS50, which is just a coincidence, but I still have it. It's literally there. It's still there, Korg IS50. I still quite like it. You know, it's a bit old. Yes, it's like nearly 25 years old now. I bought it when it was like 3 years old. Yeah, still have it. It's still going strong. It's all working. I haven't played it for quite maybe like 10 years. I put it in storage and it's been there forever. And then I retrieved it recently, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and carried on playing. After that, I had Korg Karma, which was again professional workstation. I recently had another copy of it, just sold it. And then I had lots of Yamahas. And, you know, for the majority of my music career, I've been playing Yamaha keyboards mainly. Only recently I had some Rolands for the first time, and I was really blown away, and you know, needed something new for inspiration and stuff. But I'm still, you know, a great supporter of Yamaha keyboards, and yeah, this is how my story goes, and I hope that was interesting and helpful. Thank you.
Uplink complete. Going live.
Hey there, I'm Mike. You've caught me at a bit of an awkward time at the minute because we're in the middle of orbital maneuvers right now, so there may be some interruptions. I'll do the best I can though to tell you about my first synthesizer. Before we do that though, I want to introduce you to Connie. She's the shipboard AI system and she runs just about everything here.
I'll see if I can keep Mike on track. He tends to ramble sometimes.
Alright, so my first synth was a cheap little unit called the Yamaha CS80, which I managed to pick up for $100 at a car boot sale. Like many people of my generation, I was inspired to start making music by Jean-Michel Jarre. His Rendezvous album was the first one I heard at about age 12. I remember my cousin playing it on audio cassette in the car. I was absolutely transported by the sound design. There were textures and timbres used here I'd never even thought possible.
Reorienting craft, prepare for ohms burn.
It seemed very much like there were normal musicians and then there was Jean-Michel Jarre. No one else I knew particularly liked Jarre, and I wasn't all that keen on anything else. So this was a hugely absorbing but pretty lonely experience. It was like I'd discovered a totally new world, but it was completely uninhabited. Taking all that into account, I find it kind of weird that the glorious space theme of the Rendezvous album and the fact that I grew up during the heyday of NASA's space shuttle program didn't really have any influence on me at all.
You're getting off topic, Mike. Oh, and by the way, speaking of gas, the helium buffers are full again. I'm going to need to vent them before the next stage of the station reorientation.
Yeah, okay, so I'll get back on topic. Go ahead with the purge, thank you. My first synth
was a device called the Creative Labs Sound Blaster OR32. I'm guessing you've probably never heard of this before. I can't think of any reason why anyone would buy one secondhand if they could even find one now.
It was an expansion card that plugged into a personal computer motherboard, and computer architecture has moved on light years since that time. The AW32 had a full suite of general MIDI sounds, everything from guitars and pianos, all the way through to rain and gunshot effects. By default, those sounded very much like a cheap and cheerful 1990s arranger keyboard. No surprise really, because it was based on similar technology. I bought the AW32 at full price with all my savings from the local computer shop. Bank account emptied, I excitedly went home with my prize, opened the back of my second-hand 386 computer and installed the card. I feverishly tried to load the drivers and accompanying software, and found that my computer's floppy disk drive, which had been very temperamental for some time, completely rejected the vital installation disk. I had to beg my parents for a loan so I could replace the disk drive. That was fine though, because Mum and Dad were of course overjoyed about me spending all my money on computer bits and pieces, and devoting my evenings and weekends to making music which was, in their words, a little bit like dripping taps, instead of doing my homework. The joystick port on the back of the card doubled as a MIDI input connection. I figured out how to connect the Casio keyboard that my sister and I were given as a joint Christmas present, and this became my oversized and very clunky MIDI controller. Sorry sis, I know you barely had a moment with that keyboard once I got hold of it. The AW32's software bundle ran on Windows 3.1, and it included Vienna Sound Font Studio. In this program, you could load multiple samples. There was a basic ADSR envelope for the amplitude, a filter with cutoff and resonance control, and you could apply an LFO to create vibrato. Finally, there were a basic chorus and reverb effect. And that was your lot. The bundle did include a fully featured sequencer called Windjammer. I trawled the web and I wasn't able to find any snapshots of Windjammer, but I do remember moving on to an early version of Cakewalk, which looked a little bit like this. When I finally got access to the internet, I discovered a little application called Autoy. This unlocked the chorus and reverb effects somewhat, allowing the timing parameters to be altered live in a track using a primitive form of automation via non-registered parameter numbers or NRPNs. With its huge multi-timbral palette and 32-note polyphony, it really felt for a long time like there were no limits to the music I could make. It felt like I was in possession of a full recording studio in the box. I had no understanding of things like EQ or compression because I'd had literally no exposure to any other musical equipment. Working this way really taught me how to get a half-decent mix just using levels. Around about 1998, I was given some CD-ROMs with bundles of slightly less than legitimate software. This let me upgrade Cakewalk to the Pro Audio version, and got me access to SoundForge audio editor. I played with this setup pretty much constantly throughout my whole time at university, so that's between 1995 and 2000. I recorded everything on audio cassette using just the line out of the AW32 card and the microphone socket of my little portable stereo system. I continued making music once I finished my design degree and mostly kept the tracks that I'd made for myself, but occasionally a few very patient and tolerant friends would have a listen. At some point, probably around 2005 I guess, the memory modules on the card stopped working. The Pentium 2 computer I had also needed replacing. Despite all it had done for me, the AW32 had finally reached a point of obsolescence. I don't go in for nostalgia much, and I don't tend to get attached to things. However, I do distinctly remember taking the card out of my computer and thinking how I'd really got my money's worth from the AW32. I could go on and on about what I did next to make music, the software and the bits of gear that I used following the AW32, and why the f*** I am 890 million kilometers from Earth, but I'll save that for another video. Matt, thank you so much for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed making this video, and I think your First Synths series is an inspired idea. Take care, and I'll see you soon.